everyone. Welcome to another session of American Public Policy Redux. Today is April 1st, not an April Fool's joke, ladies. We are here, as always, on our Thursday, and we're very delighted to once again welcome back Meg Goldberg. Last time we talked about technology, artificial intelligence, data gathering, machine learning, and the intersection with public policy and political science. We're going to keep in the technology space, but a completely, slightly different direction, and talk about polling technologies tonight. As always, we are recorded. So if you have a question and you ask directly, feel free to interrupt anytime. You will be recorded. If you do not wish to be recorded, just send the question on over to me, and I will be happy to read it for you. And that's all I've got. Pat, on over to you.
Okay. One thing I want to do is announce for folks that next week, Mark Belanger is going to do a session on immigration. He was pretty excited about doing it, and I think it'll be cool. A number of you don't even know Mark, so it'd be a nice introduction to Mark, who's retiring in a couple of years also. So tonight I want to do a really brief intro to simply lay a foundation for Meg to do the bulk of this and honestly the much more interesting part of it. And the foundation is to provide a description of the nature of polling and survey research technology, sort of actually for most of its history. And then Meg can take off into the changes that have occurred in just the last few years. So the two kind of methodologies that could use your phone surveys and in-person surveys, face-to-face interviews. So we had phone surveys and then the face-to-face stuff. Again, just to give you some background on this, and my direct experience came from helping run the New Jersey poll when I was a graduate student at Rutgers, and the most the most onerous, boring, aside from coding open-ended responses, involved sampling. And I'm going to take you through the step-by-step process so you can kind of get the logic of this. So we assembled all of the phone books for the state of New Jersey, and then sampled proportionate to size on all those phone books. So I went through and, quote, randomly selected numbers from each of those phone books, which amounted to taking a piece of paper, slapping it on a random column, and then writing down the number. So we had a collection of all these numbers from all the phone books. New Jersey is convenient because every square inch of New Jersey is incorporated. To my knowledge, it's the only state where every single square inch is incorporated, which made sampling easier. So we then had the prefixes then were essentially sampled proportionate to size, and we knew what the population was for all of those municipalities. So you have a list of all these numbers, and then a random number generator would add a random number to the last digits of each one of those phone numbers. We did that to reach unlisted phone numbers. Conveniently also, New Jersey, unlike what some of the states did, assigned residential and business phone numbers in blocks. So when you added that random number, you were very unlikely to get a business, which you didn't want, obviously. So you'd reach unlisted numbers as well as listed numbers. Okay. You want to get unlisted numbers because there was obviously a bias in terms of what kinds of people would choose to have their number unlisted. And then there was random selection of the male or female in the household. Okay. And the sample size was set at 1,005. So your margin of error, if you're around 50%, is plus or minus 3%, which is pretty good. In terms of the interviewers, we spent an incredible amount of time training interviewers. They would run through a number of surveys before we ever used any of their interviews. And y'all will like this, having gone to a women's college. We used only Douglas College students at Rutgers. That was the women's college at Rutgers, because they did a much better job establishing rapport over the phone, which meant they could keep people on the phone. And they would keep people on the phone for surveys that would last over a half hour. Okay. In addition, there would be a supervisor who could punch in on any interview going on, because they would do the interviews from a room and a bunch of carols. I could punch in on any line and I would just check in on them every once in a while to make sure they were doing the interview the way that they should. Are you following the questions? Are you not biasing the way you're reading the question? And that really maintained quality control on all this. The final thing is my chance to tell another story that some of you may know, but some of you may not. And that's that we would always sneak in the pre-testing of the interview, we would always sneak our home numbers in there so we could listen to the survey being done, and it would give you a different perspective on whether you had written good questions or poor questions, whatever. So y'all remember most of you remember the agenda setting survey? The first time I did it, I put my number in there and forgot about it and went off with my neighbor for a Notre Dame home football game. Came in on Monday to get, and it was always fun because students usually came from backgrounds that differed greatly from South Bend, Mishawaka denizens. So they would always tell stories of little old ladies who would start quoting the Bible to them out of the blue. Just, you would have all kinds of bizarro responses. And I would want them to tell the stories because it was fun and it was entertaining. So we get around to one of them and I asked them, did you have any problems with any of, so someone says, yeah. I interviewed this really annoying woman. I'm going through the survey and I'm struggling to keep her going. She doesn't want to do it. She's nasty about it. She just won't keep going. I get around to the education question, and the education question was a two-phase thing, two-step thing. So you ask, did you complete high school, and then for college. She asked about completing high school, and she says, and the woman got all huffy and said, I have a doctorate, and it dawned on me, and because y'all know I like to have a little fun with you, I then said, oh, that was my wife. Yeah, good times. All right, the last stage is that we would then take a look at the demographic distribution and then weight cases if we had over or under sampled folks who had various sorts of characteristics, race, sex, age, and so on, so that you would then effectively count folks who came from undersampled groups more heavily. And you would weight folks who came from oversampled groups less heavily, so that you could kind of even things out and get a more representative sample. Okay? Everybody cool? All right, the face-to-face samples are far more costly, but involve some of the same sorts of elements. Again, you're attempting to get something that resembles a random sample where every person has an equal probability of getting selected in the sample, but now you're going to do it geographically. And so I'm not going to go through the details, but you basically then start breaking the nation down into component parts and then sampling proportionate to size within those as you break it down to smaller and smaller groups. And in the end, you're doing a cluster sample where you'll pick a block and then interview a certain number of folks on that block to reduce your costs a little bit, because then they're going door to door to door, and it's not quite so expensive. And you have really, really intensive interviewer training. One of the problems is you can't monitor them like we could monitor phone surveys. You can't follow around all those interviewers. I'm gonna sort of really abbreviate this because I want to give Meg much more time there. You're doing some of the same kinds of things in the end. You're also weighting your cases to get a more representative sample. But the big thing, because I think most people wanted to get to the election prediction business, okay? They don't use face-to-face interviews when they're doing this. They're using phone surveys. They were using phone surveys back then to do this. So it's the phone survey stuff that really applies. And the last piece that we've talked about a number of times involves identifying folks who are likely voters. Different firms would define or operationalize how you figured out who is a likely voter in different ways, okay? Sometimes it was just the person saying they plan to vote. Sometimes they would have a set of predictors, okay? And then depending upon how the individual responded to those predictor questions, they would toss them into the category of being a likely voter and then do the analysis on them. Okay?
Which method was the most successful to solicit a response? Like they would most likely spend time with you face to face, like they couldn't reject you, compared to the phone that they could hang up? Or is the phone like more personal because you don't have the face to face? Which one was generally more successful at that time?
No, the in-person, the face-to-face would have a lower rate of refusal. That's kind of what you're talking about, right?
Right. There you go. Yep.
It's just they're incredibly expensive. And I think some of you got the story of one of my graduate profs who worked for Gallup, and he's a short, little, squat Jewish dude, and his wife was also short, little, and squat. They both worked for Gallup. Remember, short, Jewish. They were supposed to interview folks in person, face to face, in Harlem. Yeah, they weren't going to go there. So they filled out they filled out the survey and then submitted it. And there was no way that Gallup would know that that they had just filled out this survey. But it was like he was concerned about his safety. He didn't want to go up into Harlem. And that's an extreme case of the difference in being able to monitor your interviewers and maintain the quality of those. It's so much easier on phone surveys. So, sound good, folks? Or is it time to jump over to Meg? Let her rip, Meg.
Okay. So I warned Pat ahead of time that I have a lot of thoughts on polling, a lot of thoughts, and a lot of my thoughts probably run contrary to popular discourse on polling. So I'm going to preface all of this by saying that polling is not dead, polling is not bad, polling is not wrong, but polling has some big problems it needs to figure out, and that it's incredibly important for us to figure these things out and understand what's going wrong with polling, because polling is really important for a democracy, that this is a way that we communicate our preferences, and that without them, so like right now there's a whole bunch of like garbage going on in Iowa, and a lot Democrats are in the minority in the House and Republicans are passing what are frankly unpopular bills. And Democrats are using the state level polling we have to show representatives that Iowans don't want these policies. And in some cases, this has been really effective, that we've seen things pass in one chamber, but not the other as this polling data comes out. And even today, Biden's press secretary referenced polling data from a think tank to sort of frame the ways and reasons why they're pursuing particular policies. So polling is not this just like wonky, nerdy thing to care about. It's actually like really, really important for overcoming collective action and communicating preferences to leaders. So there's that. So I'm going to start, I guess, by talking about where polling is now. I'm going to start with, you gave us that phone polling assignment in public policy. And I think we all came back and we were like, this didn't work. Like 0 of these numbers were actual, like real phone numbers. And you were like, what? So I think I was on the edge that it was not working anymore. So there was, when lots of people had landlines, that was sort of like this like gold standard of polling, that you did random digit dialing. It was great. And we can like maybe question about whether or not that was really like this perfect ideal time. There were still biases in because obviously you're not reaching people who don't have landlines. And so now the problem is lots of people have cell phones. So that's what's led in many ways to like crises in polling, is how do we reach people if we don't have phone numbers? Or we have like cell phone numbers, but cell phones are not that useful. Like I live in Iowa, I have a 574 area code, which is South Bend, because I've had the same phone number since I was 15. So I don't ever get included in, even though I lived in Iowa for 2 years, I've never been included in Iowa polling frames or sampling frames, because my area code isn't the right one. So that's sort of what the fundamental problem is you want to take a sample, you need to have a list of everything to sample from. And that doesn't exist anymore and so landlines used to approximate that. But there's no big list of cell phone numbers, at least not like that pollsters can use. There's no big list of cell phone numbers. There's no big list of email addresses. So it's really hard to have a list to sample from. So I have fielded a fair number of not like campaign polls, but public opinion surveys. And all of mine have always been internet surveys. So that's like the world that I live in, internet surveys that are administered. You don't talk to another person at all. Right? You guys have perhaps taken internet surveys. You're just like clicking through the answers. And there's different problems with that. the most significant of which is you don't ever have a probability sample. Right? That it's never going to be a simple random sample, but it's probably not even a probability sample where everyone has at least some chance of getting in. So trying to do like the statistics and like how much uncertainty is there is really complicated. So the best we can do is spend a lot of money on, there's like maybe half a dozen existing firms that maintain lists of samples, and they can give you a nationally representative survey, which is about as good as it gets. And that's that your respondents will match the US population on a set of characteristics, and you usually can specify, but it's incredibly expensive to get a survey. This is like the most high pressure, other than like defending my dissertation, the worst moment I ever had in grad school was sending out a survey that I didn't realize until the day I sent it out cost like $40,000 to have 500 people take a kind of long survey. But this is, if you've ever seen ads from like YouGov or Survey Sampling International, that one you probably haven't seen, but YouGov is like more common. My dad's on a YouGov panel, that people sign up for these websites. You get paid a small amount of money for every survey you take, or you get, YouGov pays you with like gift cards. You get like points for taking surveys. And so YouGov collects all of your information and then they rope you into these other surveys. So this is what's used by academics. It's used by marketing firms. When I was on a YouGov panel, when I started using YouGov, I joined a panel to sort of see, I usually encourage people who are going to use YouGov to be a YouGov panelist, take surveys, see what it's like, see what's bad, see what's good. And man, I took a lot of surveys that were like, which do you prefer? And then it would give you like 8 gas stations. And I was like, oh, I deeply don't care about taking this survey. So that's sort of I won't say it's a standard, but that's sort of one of the new frontiers. So there's phone surveys that still get used a lot. I will say I lied. I am in one Iowa group, like on one Iowa call list. I think it's through like the party, because I get like local polls and state politics polls, but I'm not on like the big list. So I think I'm in like the Cedar Rapids Gazette, like polling sample, and that's it. So there are still phone surveys. Now they're also automated. So those have a terrible response rate though, right? If you like get an automatic voice, you're like, no, thank you. So they're automated. There are like person-to-person phone surveys. There are these in-person ones, which almost never get used anymore for horse race polling for a campaign. They're still used on very expensive surveys like the American National Election Study. Exit polling is still face-to-face. But then there are also internet polls. So that's sort of the new frontier, but there is no way really in any of these methods anymore to get you can get a representative sample, but you can't get like a beautiful random sample. But that doesn't stop us. We still poll anyway. So one of the, I guess, advances in the last, gosh, when did Nate Silver get famous? Like 2012? I don't remember. So now we're taking a turn to where I mean to Nate Silver for a little bit. So the biggest change in polling has been like this situation of different methods. And then there's also this other side where we've started doing more election prediction. So I will say too, the one thing I wanted to, Nate Silver runs a website called 538, and he got very famous in 2008 initially, maybe, because he predicted every state correctly on his little blog. And then his little blog was first purchased by like ESPN, and now it's, because he also does sports analytics, and it was purchased by ABC, and now it's one of like the most trafficked political websites.
And his dad was a political scientist at Michigan State.
Wait, I did not know that. That's why he thinks he knows so much.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, but he started out in baseball.
Yes, he started out in
baseball.
Yeah.
But his dad was a political scientist at Michigan State.
Fair enough. So the other big, so when just looking at polling, this methods issue is a problem. There's also increasingly problems with how you do, Pat mentioned the weighting, that when you first take your survey and you look at like who you have, it's not going to match the population. And so you try to get a good sample to start with, but then you also, after you get your sample, do this weighting thing. That if you have fewer like Black women in your sample than there are in the US, but you want to be able to say something about the US, you give those women more weight in the final calculations. And so sometimes that gives you really funky results. So like there is this one set of polls in 2016 that were showing that Trump had like bonkers support among Black men, like 60% or something. Well, it turned out they had only surveyed like 2 Black men. And one of them happened to be a Trump supporter. And he was getting weighted like 30,000 times the like average white man in the survey. So you can end up with these like small populations getting really weird results. That's also why a lot of these like national surveys, you can't actually say anything about particular states, especially states with small populations. And you certainly can't necessarily say anything about like a particular congressional race or anything like that. You have to do polls specifically for that state or that district.
Can we back up a second?
Yeah.
Because I just want to make sure I understand this point clearly. So I understand everything you're talking about, but what I want to go to is you said that there are some places where you can go and get lists, get, of various quality. Are you saying even those organizations suffer from the same problems? So are you actually saying that all the surveys, all the data that's reported is not based on a random sample?
Yes,
So,
but there has never been a survey
well,
ever
I
that's a
understand.
random sample of the US.
And I live a little bit in this world, so I know, yeah. But
Yeah,
hopefully you're going to get to like, then how do you have any validity to anything that we're looking at? So anyway, you're going to go there, but right.
yeah. I mean, so this is like the world of social science, is that we don't have perfect random samples or random assignment to anything. So we figure out ways to get around it. And that's what benchmarking against the census, to say if we match on these demographic characteristics, we think we've matched on everything that's important.
Okay, that makes sense.
The problem, though, is that sometimes we don't match on the things that end up being important. So one of the big problems in 2016 was that in previous years, it hadn't been actually that important to weight on education. And the issue was that we have seen a polarization based on educational attainment. And so more and more people with higher levels of education are not voting Republican, and that's become like more polarized. And people with higher levels of education are more likely to answer surveys for whatever reason. And so not waiting on education meant that you were not getting, that was causing a problem. And that's why, that's actually the big reason that polls underestimated Trump's support in 2016, was not weighting people with lower levels of education highly enough, because in the past it was fine, and then it became more important for vote choice. So if you're not waiting on something that has a big influence on how people vote, then you start to run into trouble. The other problem that polls are increasingly running into is response rates are getting terrible. And on their own, that's not necessarily a problem. Like that's not the only indication that a poll is doomed. And you can get really high response rates and still have a crappy poll if your sample is bad. But the problem with the low response rates is that there's bias, like I said, in who's responding. And so we're starting to see partisan non-response bias that, there's lots of talk about like shy Trump voters, that Trump voters, you get them on the phone or on their surveys and they would lie about who they supported, but that's not really supported by the data. What is actually probably happening is that people who support Trump are just not likely to answer the phone at all for a survey. Or they pick up the phone and realize it's a survey and they hang up. That's a problem for everyone, but it's more of a problem for Trump supporters. So that's another part of the problem. And then I think this is the last hurdle for polls right now is figuring out when it comes to vote choice, what the model looks like for that. Because that was sort of another layer of the problems on 2016 is people have these fancy models that predict whether or not you're going to turn out to vote based on demographic characteristics. And in 2016, turnout was not the same. And the models they had to predict whether a person would vote didn't work as well. But you don't know that they're not going to work until after the election. So you have to use previous experience to guess. So that was where 2016 also ran into problems. So there was there's a polling firm in Des Moines, Iowa, the Ann Seltzer poll, and her method of doing this. So she came out with a poll. It was like right before the election. People panicked because it showed Trump. This was in 2020, like 8 points ahead in Iowa, 7 points ahead in Iowa, and all of these other outlets had Iowa as a toss-up. And it had all of these congressional races that all of these outlets said were probably safe for Democrats. She had Republicans winning. And all of these like pollsters and people were like, don't panic, it's fine. And, you know, people who consume a lot of political polling were like, oh my gosh, this is like what's happening here. And the explanation for her difference was she still uses random digit dialing to get people on landlines. And she does like some cell phone sampling, but her weighting scheme is she literally just says, are you going to vote? And if you tell her yes, then she says, all right, you're a voter. Not her herself. She has like a lot of people doing this for her. But she keeps things very simple. She's very like old school like that. And it turned out she was right. Trump took Iowa by like 8 points. All of the Republicans she had as ahead won their races. And I had to like, you know, eat humble pie or whatever the phrase is, because I did like a media interview where they're like, should Democrats be worried about this? I was like, no, it's an outlier. It's fine. Random digit dialing gives you weird results sometimes. And then the next day I was like, well, so I was not correct about that. But so that's sort of the big things for polls are to figure out weighting schemes. Weighting schemes work a lot like the TSA. It's like after something bad happens, then you like fix that particular tiny problem, but you won't like anticipate future problems. So there's that. They have to figure out their weighting schemes. They have to figure out this non-response problem, and they have to figure out what do we do about the fact that there's no solid method of reaching people anymore to get a good sample. So that's like the three big problems in modern polling. But all of that also interacts with election prediction. So I'm going to share a few different slides. What do I want to start with here? From talking about this with my students. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, let's see, this is not what I want. So election prediction, even though I have a lot of slides, Pat.
No, I think Pat's laughing at a question that someone just put up.
I'm laughing again.
Oh boy.
Let me go ahead and respond to Anne. There's a difference between being dumbass lucky. She was dumbass lucky.
Okay, but that's kind of not what I took from what Meg said. What I took from what she said was
Well,
Anne's question was why not learn from her methods if the old school poller was correct.
I have one image for you, Anne. Here's what she did.
So I'm
She
going to
happened to
disagree.
get
But do we know
lucky.
that? Here's the question.
Target.
So that could be, but
No, no,
was
no,
it
no, no, no.
tested? Like, do we know that empirically?
So I'm going to talk about this with
Well-
prediction methods a little bit too.
I
The
mean,
degree
I
to
don't know.
which
I don't know anything about it. I'm just,
the degree to which any polling methods or results are like falsifiable is kind of a tricky question. Right. And that makes it like a hard scientific enterprise because you can't do science if your like hypothesis is not falsifiable. So was she right or did she get lucky? And it's unclear. She has a pretty good track record. But what's likely is that she has stumbled on something that works for Iowa. That right, and when you get a call, it's like, this is the Des Moines Register, and the Des Moines Register is like a well-regarded poll. It's very salient in like the caucuses, like people like wait for the Des Moines Register poll. People know what this is in Iowa, and so she has better response rates too. So that's likely, but she will also be one of the first to acknowledge that she is sort of kicking the can down the road with this random digit dialing problem. That if there were more urban areas in Iowa, it probably wouldn't work as well. If there was a larger like young population in Iowa, it probably wouldn't work as well.
See, that's where I'm going to go. Is that you're dumbass lucky until you can explain why that particular way of running your poll and extrapolating from the results in your sample to the population, why it worked that way. And part of what Meg's getting at there is, it's kind of hard. It's kind of hard to know that. But I don't, it's not as though she stumbled or found this way that's better than other ways, because I mean, I don't think she could articulate exactly all those issues that Meg is bringing up. Okay, so is this a fluke because it's Iowa and has these characteristics, and you would need to change the way that you did this if you did it in New York State? Okay, so until you can do that, then you don't have a method that you can learn from and adapt to different state environments. Sorry, run with it, Meg.
No, it's fine. It's fine. And like, I don't know that she would reveal this if it were the case that they have. Actually, I should see if she releases her raw data. You could test her weighting procedure. If she has demographic information, you could try weighting schemes and see if any of those do better. I don't know that she does that. And I don't know that she collects that information either to even make that possible, but that would be one thing you could do. All right, so which one of these do I actually want? Election prediction has a long history. And this is what I want. Let me share this. So there is a very old model called the fundamentals model. This is just one of them that basically takes into account pre-campaign status of the incumbent president and the second quarter GDP growth and whether or not there's an incumbent. And this model, they throw the data in, they get an equation out, and they literally just plug in the numbers every year and say, this is what the popular vote is going to be. The premise of this is that you can predict the election outcomes by knowing the net approval of the president in, I think, June before the election, the second quarter GDP growth, and whether or not it's an incumbent. That's all you need, and it gets you pretty close to the popular vote. So this is sort of building on this has been what election predictions have been doing for years and years and years. But since 2008, and since the ability to use more advanced methods with tons of data has improved, you've gotten much fancier methods of election prediction. So that's what I'm going to sort of talk about with Nate Silver. And I'm going to talk about the Economist one a little bit, it's run by a 23-year-old. It's like a little boy genius named G. Elliott Morris. But this is also where, if you watch on election night, like the New York Times Needles, it's using like a similar method. So in like 2012, Nate Silver, who's one of the people who does this election prediction stuff, was basically like, yeah, these models that use what are called the fundamentals, like the context that the race is happening in, and don't really look at polls, are doing really badly. And they have like no predictive power. And this was especially true this year, that who's the Time for Change? Is that Abramowitz? I think it's Abramowitz. The guy who does this.
Certainly one of the models, yeah.
The guy who does this Time for Change model that's based on like economic performance. If you put all the stuff in for 2020, it predicted Trump would get like 17% of the vote, the popular vote.
Yes.
And he was
That's it.
He was like, well, that's not correct. We should change that. So his 2020 model was literally just approval ratings in June. That was it. That was his whole model. And I was like, this is no longer a fundamentals model. This is a model of public opinion. And that is competing with these really sophisticated models from The Economist and from this 538 website. So for those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to share. Let's see. I have too many windows open here. What those look like. So since apparently not everyone is glued to this on the like weeks before the election, this is 538's election forecast page. As you can see up here, it is no longer updating. So this is what they produce. This, like, they have not changed this since the night before the election. And so what these prediction websites do is compile a lot of polls. They compile almost every poll that's done. And they generate these predictions, these probabilistic forecasts of who's going to win, right? So this is like my number one beef or complaint, is that these are very hard to interpret. That most people think of them more like they think of polls than they think of them as like weather forecasts, right? Because they're a lot more like weather forecasts. You know, when you say there's like an 80% chance of rain, than they are polls. And I know that that misunderstanding exists because I cannot tell you how many times, even in the last year and a half of teaching college students, come to me and say, no, polling doesn't work because 538 said that Biden was going to get 90% of the vote. Or polling doesn't work because in 2016, they said Clinton was going to get 75% of the vote. But what they're actually saying is that, and to 538's credit, this is a massive, like what you see here is a massive change from 2016. That they are saying, based on 40,000 simulations we did, based on polling, that in 90% of those simulations, Biden wins. So what they're saying is that Biden's win is very likely, and Trump's win is very unlikely. Right. So there's really good and bad things about these types of forecasts. The good thing is, well, the reason we care about them at all is that there is evidence that people being exposed to this information changes their behavior, changes who they vote for, it changes whether or not they vote. And so we care about how people are interpreting these. So there's good and bad. One is that it aggregates a lot of polling. And so instead of you having to figure out, like there's all this data out there, there's all these articles that are like, oh, a new poll is released. This is in a systematic way telling you how you interpret new information, because it's actually doing that. So this model gets updated every time there's a new poll out. This model gets updated, and you could like see shifts. You could also on election night, you could say like, oh, so-and-so won this state, and it would like change the update. This is also unlike a lot of other prediction models. This is forecasting the result in every single state and then putting that together and looking at the electoral college, right? That's like the big innovation here, is that we're not looking at who's going to win the popular vote. It's who's going to win the electoral college. The bad part is that people suck at interpreting probabilities. We really not good at it. We need like interpretive schema here. And 538 is giving us interpretive schema when they say like Biden is favored to win. But they're the ones who decided like, what's the threshold for us saying Biden's favored to win versus like it's a toss up. They're giving us this like English translation of it. But the example I like to give is during senior week at St. Mary's, we were going to go to Cedar Point. And I called my mom. I was like, oh, there's a 50% chance of rain. Maybe we shouldn't go. And my mom was like, there's only a 50% chance of rain. And so that two people can hear the same forecast and have very different interpretations of it and make different decisions based on it. And so that's sort of why this type of prediction is dicey in how people are going to interpret it. So lots of political scientists who are very smart and very trained to interpret this type of data were like flipping out on election night that 538 was wrong again. But realistically, 538 predicted that Biden was likely to win, but they predicted like a lot of these outcomes here are very close races. And so you have this idea in your head that if he has a 90% chance of winning, or he wins 89 out of 100 times, that it's going to be a blowout, right? It's really easy to make that cognitive leap. But the problem is a lot of these predicted outcomes were close. And so what 538 predicted was that there's going to be a lot of close outcomes that give a narrow win to Biden. And so an 89% chance of winning doesn't mean it's not going to be a nail biter, right? So that's one of my beefs. The other one is this idea of falsifiability, that 538 is like, look, we were great. We got this right. And they did the same thing in 2016 when the predictions looked kind of similar to this, but the election went the other way. And their explanation was like, well, yeah, we said Trump was unlikely to win, but we still said there was almost a 30% chance. It's just that the unlikely thing happened. And so as like a consumer of information, what do you do with that? How do you interpret in 2024 or even in the midterms? How do you incorporate that into your priors about what you believe when you get new information? That it's really difficult to know how to do this. So on the one hand, it's good that we don't get this like yo-yo effect of new surveys coming out and new polls coming out, that it helps you aggregate all that information. The bad side is it's hard to interpret and hard to understand. And I will leave it at that, even though I could probably talk about election prediction for way too long.
So you were mentioned that the other model was looking solely at polling data. Can you real quick, in case I might have missed it, the poll, what is 538? Is it only taking into consideration polling data like in historical and aggregating that, or are there any other factors it's taking into account?
So they shift as you get closer to the election as further out. So they launch their poll in the summer before the election usually. And at that point, there are some of the like fundamentals. So there's like economic performance and some like Gallup approval ratings in there. And then as you get closer to the election, the polls are more predictive than these fundamentals. And so the fundamentals drop out of the model. So they're doing that based on past elections, what's most predictive as you get closer. So by the time you get to like the couple weeks before the election, it is polls only. But it's aggregating lots of polls, and they have quality scores that weight how much a poll matters.
Is it likely that they would change their messaging in the future to indicate the tightness? Because I only heard that like the night of the election when Nate Silver was on ABC, I think it
Yeah.
was, and discussing how, yes, like I heard from his mouth, yes, we said 89 out of 100, but know that those 89 are all very close. And if one of those goes, it skews our model, you can watch it on our website sort of deal. So do you think that they're going to change that? Or do you think that 538 is going to stay in the current messaging that they have now of making a clear cut line?
Yeah, I think they'll update. So I think one thing that Nate Silver is bad at is that he is very online. And so he's like, I tell people this all the time, but he's telling them on Twitter or he's telling you in his podcast. And like, that's not, I listen to his podcast, but most people don't. And so he's missing like broad swaths of people with that message. So I think they did, to, like I said, to their credit, there's a huge change in the last 4 years about how they talk about their model. But I think it's possible, right, that they're going to sort of highlight that in the future because Nate Silver got a lot of flack for that.
I think part of the problem also is that the stakes were just so high that, I mean, certainly, you know, when I would get asked about the election outcome in both 2016 and 2020 by folks at St. Mary's, they would plead with me, please give me some hope or some assurance that Trump won't win. Well, when you see one of the alternatives as an existential threat, it's hard to then wade through the complexities of probability because you simply want reassurance that the horrible, awful, existentially disastrous outcome won't occur. So some of it is really not their fault. It's just the situation that people found themselves in, and they desperately wanted, you know, some sense of security.
And I think the 538 guys will admit that a little bit too, like that was they wanted that too. And so that affected the way they talked about it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Hey, Meg, I've got a question for you. It's Adrian. I was curious about, have they used the model and looked like in history to try and validate how accurate it would be in predicting past elections as an attempt to validate its accuracy or its precision? Do you know if 538's done that?
I think they have. I think they tested their 2020 model against 2016, and that it did better, if I'm remembering that correctly. But there might have been, there's some like weird insider kerfuffle that goes on, like that went on with 538 about like their transparency and stuff like that, because like other forecasters are more transparent, and like you can look at their code and stuff. But they said they did validate it. But that's like one thing about 538 too, that it's all proprietary for them. And so you can't like, they explain as well as they can what's going on like under the hood, but you can't actually like look at it. But yes, they do. And one of the other improvements that they've made from 2016 to 2020 is also extending the historical data that's driving their model. They have extended it back like further and further and further, to which I'm kind of like, it's not even actually relevant. Like, it's not helpful to have data from the early 19th century, but okay.
Well, and
No.
I think, I mean, this is part of the discussion that we've already had, is that if something fundamental has changed in our elections, in our politics, then the old models could be expected to perform poorly. And I mean, I think Trump is key in this difficulty for lots of reasons. There are lots of ways in which he changes the politics, which means the old models don't work as well. But you still don't. Okay, so let's say, God willing, Trump is in Sing Sing for 2024. Nonetheless, do the things that occurred because of his candidacies in 2016 and 2020 live on? Do they continue to affect the dynamics of elections and voting behavior? Or is he the two-hit wonder? And you have those distortions. We would think of them as distortions then, right? Distortions of voting behavior live and die, 2016 and 2020, and then they're gone. And you have no way of knowing. You can make some educated guesses, but you have no way of knowing.
I have another question. If you look at, let's say 2020, 2016, 2012, 2008. October, the October surprise, there's always something. Is it worth looking at polls prior to October? I know that the research about the influence, or I've heard the research about influencing voting behavior, which could influence the polls at that point, and having to account for that. But as far as accuracy at the end, is it one of those where the model isn't quite accurate until that time? Or is there a significant amount of change? Maybe that's not necessarily about accuracy, but the change from October to voting day, is there a big change in the polling, either results or method?
So I think you can look at, there are people who sort of collect the 538 predictions as they go. I mean, 538 obviously like keeps them as well. But you do start to see like less, at the beginning of the summer, the model kind of like jumps around. And then it gets like narrower and narrower. And you can see as you get closer and closer to the election, it's not changing. But the narrowness is like, it's still pretty small pre-October. So I think one thing about October surprises, sometimes they're real, but it's also like anytime something happens in October, we're like, October surprise. Even if it's not actually that big of a deal. But the other thing about like Trump in particular was that nothing changed his approval rating. Nothing. Like the steadiest approval rating anyone has ever had, and one of the steadiest disapproval ratings. And that's another, that's when Pat mentions features of elections that have, and politics that have fundamentally been changed by Trump. That's sort of one that's, I think, out there up for the debate, because we're seeing a similar, like very steadiness in like Biden's approval rating, that it's actually looking like Trump's, and people aren't, which is crazy. You should think that someone who like achieved his first 100-day goal of vaccinations in 50 days, you think that would change approval ratings like a smidge, and nothing. And so that's casting some doubt on like some very big theories of political science. But that's sort of the, if this is the case, it might be that people are going to decide who they're voting for earlier and earlier. And so then it becomes a more and more a turnout game that the model is still kind of figuring out how you do that. If you have wild turnout swings from election to election, election prediction gets harder.
Yeah. The problem with October surprises is that you don't know whether there has been effectively an October surprise until the second week of November. You don't know until after the election's over. So usually the real October surprises get identified when the predictions go wrong. I give you 1980. Okay. And in retrospect, you then saw Oh my God, the hostages in Iran and the developments over the course of the weekend. And when you had more sort of microscopic polling going on those days, then you had evidence that things were shifting in that direction. But you didn't really know that the hostages in Iran would create the October surprise that happens in November. So you're not going to know it in advance. And Meg's right. Once you have something like that, then everybody's looking for one. So is there going to be something that's going to change things dramatically? But I think Meg's absolutely right. I mean, now it's because of that partisan polarization. And I'm going to push back a little bit on, they're certainly, this is a little surprising when folks don't adjust their evaluations of the president when the president performs well. But there's been for a little while now literature out there like evaluations of the economy, all sorts of things that are now really, really driven by partisanship to a degree that far exceeds that of the past. And so we do know that that's changing. But I think the cool thing that Meg hits there is, okay, then that's going to change electoral behavior as well and turn it into a turnout game. I think that's on the money.
So I was listening to this really cool podcast, and it was about David Duke and his run for the Senate, but also the governor in Louisiana. And I live in New Orleans. So I'm not from New Orleans. I moved here. So I've been like on this like Louisiana history kick lately. And it analyzed the 92 governor race. It was between three individuals, a Republican, a Democrat, and then David Duke, who I think was running as a Republican, but he's, kind of that weird, And so the poll is the same thing.
You can say Nazi, it's okay.
Yeah, no. I'm getting there. And so the polling was skewed because people were closeted David Duke supporters, or closeted racists, and like the same shyness that we kind of see with Trump, but I think even more so because David Duke was literally a KKK wizard and a Nazi, like an open Nazi. So I think it was even more so. And they were all the polls were jacked because it was showing that the lowest percentage, he was getting like these crazy low percentages. So they had to start asking questions that were geared towards not asking about David Duke, but like policies and views that would support him so they could get like a representative sample. And that kind of goes back to like what you were saying about the weighted, but it was like eerily similar with Trump and what we've seen in the Trump poll. And it was crazy because I'm like, this is really like this, the first time that happened, I feel like was that election. And it was super interesting, but.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a really old, not really old, but there's also, there used to be this thing called the Bradley effect that Black candidates would overperform their eventual performance in the polls because you wouldn't say that you were voting for like the non-Black candidate because you didn't want to seem racist. Mm-hmm. So you're like, I got to say I'm voting for him and so people were worried about that with Obama. But then a couple of people did like they looked at a ton of different races where Black candidates ran against non-Black candidates and found that doesn't happen anymore. But that's one good thing too about internet surveys is that you get less of that because people are more willing to tell like a random block on the computer that whoever you're voting for. So you get rid of some of those like interviewer effects.
Well, it's a sort of social acceptability thing. And the interesting thing there is that what's socially acceptable has changed. So moving from, I don't want to admit I'm voting for the African-American candidate to, I don't want to admit I'm voting for the racist demagogue. Yeah, and by the way, Bradley is after Tom Bradley, who was mayor of Los Angeles. First Black mayor of LA. And that cropped up with Virginia governor's race.
But also Louisiana is like fascinating. Their governorship, like with the open primary and John Bell Edwards.
It's wild. Yes. Like the open primary is one thing. And then like I live in New Orleans and there's so much just on like mayors in New Orleans. It's like jacked all across the board. It's wild. And the politics here are crazy because I don't know. It's just, it's literally Tetris and corruption all in one.
Yeah, among political scientists who do stuff on state politics, they will often kind of refer to Louisiana, a place like Louisiana's state politics, any other state in the country. There's this wild outlier. Yeah.
And there, it's really fascinating. The podcast is called Slow Burn, and they did like 4 seasons. They had one on Watergate, one on the Clinton impeachment, and then David Duke. And it was cool. That was the only voting piece of it, but yeah.
I listened to an audiobook recently that was kind of similar, called Culture Warlords, I think. And it's by a Jewish journalist who infiltrated like 4chan and 8chan and was like pretending to be an incel sometimes. And then sometimes she would pose as a woman and like try to expose, like her main goal was to get their names and just like expose them. And so she was talking about the difference between 2016 and 2020 and how white supremacists turned on Donald Trump because they thought he was listening to too many Jewish voices and like other people of color. And they were like, well, we're not going to vote for him anymore. So I was wondering if there was any type of support for that in the polls, but I feel like nobody is going to openly be like, I'm a white supremacist.
So part of the problem with polling has been that those people are people who have usually like very few social connections. Like they're not in, like by social connections, I don't mean like they're on 4chan, but like they're not involved in their church or any like community organizations that they like maybe go to work and then they go home and like they're on the computer in the basement. Those are people who don't get contacted by polling firms. And so, but then like in 2016, they voted for him. And so that's like, those are the people who are on like turnout models, like, oh, they're never voting. Because if you don't have any connection to your community, the likelihood that you like go and do your civic duty is like 0. But the way in which Trump was able to prime that like sense of nationalism was really powerful for that group to get them to the polls. So yeah, that was like, I don't think there's any polling on them because I think those are the people that are really hard to get on the phone.
And who wouldn't respond?
Right.
Your earlier point. Yeah.
That's what, when you were mentioning, Pat, like things that were new to Trump and that might go back to the old models in 2024, I was like, well, these types of people. But then I was thinking about how if he got more turnout in 2020 versus 2016, and that group of people might not have voted for him in 2020, then who were those other new voters? Maybe it was like less or not as bad white supremacy.
Yeah, so actually, yes. There's a really, really good book that my class just read this week called White Identity Politics, by this professor at Duke, Ashley Jardina. And her argument basically is that Obama first, as like a Black man, represented a threat to the racial hierarchy in the US, and that lots of people, like 40% of white Americans, have some degree of like white racial solidarity, right? These are not like white supremacists. Well, they're not white nationalists. This is like much more average people have a sense of like racial solidarity, that their being white is important to them, that they think there's a lot that white people have to be proud of. And she basically shows that then that translates into support for Trump, because you want policies and candidates. This isn't about policies that you're opposed to, policies that would help non-white people, but that you are seeking out candidates and policies to support that disproportionately help white people, and that Trump promised to help white people, and that generated that. And so that was priming that, even if we hold that this like white racial identity, that Trump politicized it in a way that had not been politicized before. So I'm still digesting this book, even though I literally taught it. But there's something there, I think.
That was one of the other things that she did, which was really fascinating and horrible for her, because like she is Jewish, and so she would talk about how she was like attacked and outed in these forums as this Jewish woman that they would attack on Twitter and stuff. And so one of the other things that she did was join a whites only dating website. And I was like, I just don't even know how she did it for as long as she did, but it was a really fascinating read.
Yeah.
Totally
And-
reading that like ASAP. That sounds awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's and the I mean there's classic research taking a look at racial attitudes, and it's there's a classic article on attitudes toward busing. And forgive me because I know I mentioned this in classes at various points in time, but it's a great study. I think this was David Sears was one of the main authors on this. You're looking at whites' opposition to busing. Well, if you listen to whites talking about their opposition to having their kids bused, they'll talk about how long the kids were on the bus. Well, actually, if you ask questions about how you feel about your kid dating an African American, that's what predicts it. It's parents terrified that their kid will end up in a relationship with an African American. That part of it really drives that racial intolerance. It's at the heart of where that is. It's on that personal level. I don't want my kids dating Black folks.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Any other questions? Meg, what's your next chapter? We're ready for your next session.
Oh gosh.
Keep going. We'll keep listening.
I don't know. Right now, I'm like very steeped in all the identity politics stuff since I'm teaching that right now. But anything, I'm game.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. I'm like very excited that I can walk away and look at polling and then say, well, it's more like a weather forecast than
That's my,
you know.
that's my big takeaway. That's good.
Takeaway, yeah.
Yes, but also a plug for the Economist forecast. It's pretty good.
Hmm.
I also just like, it's like a little baby child doing it. And I'm like,
Yeah, can you talk about him for a quick minute? You kind of teased that a little bit. He's 23.
yeah, I mean, he started his like a political blog in college in 2015, and then did his model went viral, but not really viral, like among some people. His predictions in 2018 were like very on the nose, which is like how you come of age in forecasting, is that you have a forecast on your little blog or whatever, and it is right. And so he got hired by The Economist right out of college. He majored in like computer science and stats and politics at University of Texas, UT Austin. And so now he works for The Economist. But really just like, he's super thoughtful. And and super thoughtful about the implications of what he's doing, which is why I like him a lot. Cares a lot and engages a lot with sort of a lot of the scholarly literature, whereas Nate Silver has gotten a little bit of like a chip on his shoulder recently. And so I judge them based on their personalities. But he's just really, and he has worked closely with some colleagues that I know, to, improve his work. So I really like him, even though his forecast was like, I think he was showing a 95% chance of Biden winning, which I was like, slow your roll. This is too high. Like any probabilistic forecast should not be that high. It's like anytime the Weather Channel says there's 100% chance of rain, I'm like, is there? Unless it's literally raining right now, we're not getting to 100%.
What do you do in those scenarios? Like, do you go back into your data? Do you go back into your assumptions? Like, what is the process when you realize, whoa, this is way off?
So that's actually one thing to his credit, is that he didn't do that. He was like, look, the model is hands off at this point, because me coming in and adjusting it is like contrary to the purpose of this. I have my model. I'm not tweaking it until like after the election. Next election cycle, I'll work on it, but I'm not doing it now. And he was confident in his prediction. And he gets a little more grace because he basically like posts his code that other people can dig into and see exactly what he's doing. So, I mean, like in the write up to the election, there are very boring, very detailed conversations on his Twitter feed about how he's calculating his clustered standard errors. Like just very in the weeds conversations. But the people who do this kind of work, especially the academics, appreciate that openness. And so they're like, yeah, G. Elliott Morris, you're the dude. And I call him, he's like, it's G. Elliott. And there's a weird thing with him and Nate Silver, that Nate Silver calls him George instead of Elliot. But I call him Jelliot in my head, so I can't. But once you like know there's some rivalry too, if you read or listen to the 538 podcast, they'll like talk about it a little bit. Like Nate Silver will be like, we don't do this like certain other forecasters. So it's interesting, but competition is good in this case.
And he does the breakdown of state by state as well for his.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow. So he's more like Nate created the concept of moving from the old into the new, adding more information, including polling.
Exactly.
And then this younger kid comes along and was like, look, I think you could do this a little bit better, get some notoriety for it, gets hired by someone. So now there's some.
Exactly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question, because I thought you said 538, they pull in a lot of different models. And
So they have one model that they work with, like that they developed, that changes every election cycle a little bit, but they're pulling in polling data. So they don't actually do their own polling.
it's the
They're
polling
pulling in
data.
everyone else's polling data.
Is there anybody who takes a look at and tracks a lot of the different models and then sort of does predictive modeling? I know at CDC when I was working on COVID, that was one of the things that they did, was there were different predictive models about what was going to happen with mortality or hospitalization,
Right.
whatever. And they literally, you'd see the plot, they were all somewhat different, but then it's sort of plot
Right.
that you could follow and see where things were.
Like an aggregator of aggregations.
Yeah, is there anything like that in polling?
I don't think there is, because I don't think that there's enough. Like there's really only 3, probably like New York Times, 538, and The Economist, but really even just 538 and The Economist are the 2 that are using something remotely similar. There's lots of other people who do election forecasting, but they're garbage. Like there's some historian, what is his name? You know who I'm talking about.
He has the 7 keys to the presidency.
Yeah, it's trash. It's trash.
It is. Yeah.
My intro to American politics class like tore it apart, and I was like, see, this wasn't hard.
But
You know, he-
sadly, journalists will haul his ass up for interviews every 4 years, and
They
he
need to stop.
trots out the garbage every 4 years, and yeah.
It's trash. Yeah. I mean, it's stuff like he puts in charisma, but he said like that Obama wasn't charismatic in 2008, but was in 2012, or maybe the reverse. And I was like, same person has fundamentally changed like personalities. Like, what are you doing?
Remember his name?
And so charismatic.
Let's
Do
see.
some Googling. I because the thing is too, is that, I mean, someone asked it as well. If you read about the insider of different individuals that have run for president, they are being coached on that model,
Right.
that your charisma numbers are this, the economy is this way, therefore you're more likely to there, therefore your talking point should be about this. So he's not just influencing, the understanding of what's going on in opinion polls, he's influencing how politicians are responding and behaving.
Yeah,
But he's garbage. I love it.
Yay. That's politicians don't know squat about any of this, and it makes them, I mean, the sad thing is it makes them incredibly vulnerable to political consultants. And so all Meg did the sort of positive side of this. This kid does the model, it works really well, he gets picked up by economists, everybody lives happily ever after. But political consultants make money off this. So they then predict they're behind a campaign and they predict an outcome and their candidate wins. Well, that's gold. And they use that to market themselves all over the place, because the candidates don't, and in a sense, you don't want them. That's not what you want them to know. That's not what you want them to spend their time thinking about. But it makes them vulnerable to that kind of nonsense. I mean, I had direct experience with that when I first got out to St. Mary's, and the guys in the department were connected, and we didn't do the survey ourselves, but the idiots who ran the survey for the Democratic candidate for the House, they didn't know how to count. So I did the data analysis on this stuff. It was a horrible sample with lousy questions done like a couple of months before the election. So I fiddled with it. I gave him certain pieces of strategic advice, which went nowhere because his campaign was disorganized. I run into him a few years later in a courthouse in Mishawaka, and he comes up to me warmly saying, "Thanks. I never got a chance to tell you how much I appreciated that the predictions in your survey turned out close to the outcome." Well, it was just accidental that a crappy sample done too far in advance was exactly what the outcome was in the district. But I thanked him. I walked away. But
this is where the Obama campaign did really well, was that they hired some pretty solid people. I mean, one of the people that did a bunch of data for them is now a professor at like Caltech or something, in stats and political science. And Hillary's campaign tried. They tried. Most of their data team was harvested from either recent PhDs in political science and data science or current students, which I'm still bitter about. I lost one of my cohort mates to Hillary's campaign, to the data team. But the Democratic Party has made a lot of progress in recruiting academics to do better research, and they've been like using that research to their advantage, I think, more than Republicans. there's a little bit of a supply problem for Republicans.
We get what we pick up what you're putting down. That was actually one of my follow-up questions was whether the polling that the internal teams, because in previous sessions, we've talked about how state elections rely upon the polling. Like it's difficult to know what's going on at a local level, right? So they rely upon these larger and the disconnect between that. Do they find that these larger national, more established academic polling, are they using the political campaigns? Are they matching what the internal campaigns are doing, or vice versa?
So I think I might be wrong about this, but my memory is that 2020 congressional internal campaigns were quite good. Like I feel like I saw that discussion somewhere. But that is not replicated in every district because you have to have quite a few resources to be able to do that polling. So like yesterday in conversations with Democratic candidates in Iowa who didn't have like investment from the party, even though they had quite a bit of money, they weren't able to do great polls. On the other hand, like I'm sure the internal polls being done by like the Joni Ernst, Teresa Greenfield campaign were great because they had those two campaigns, because they had millions and millions and millions, tens of millions of dollars pouring in from across the country. So when you have resources, I think your internal polling can be decent. But there might be also some partisan, I don't know, there's decent polling firms that are Republican. So I think there's probably good.
But it's always going to be much more difficult to do congressional districts. To do House races,
Right.
it's always going to be more difficult, way more difficult to do.
Great. Anyone else? Anything else? Well, thank you so much, Meg. We greatly appreciate your time and
Thank you.
representing St. Mary's so well. It's super fascinating. We love your knowledge and your clear ability to bring it across in a fun and understandable way for people that are not quite as familiar with this aspect of political science. So we greatly appreciate it. We'll see everyone, and we hope to have you back again. We're going to find a reason to have you come back again, if you don't mind. And thank your husband for taking care of the kiddos too. So
I will.
we can borrow your
I
time.
heard any screaming, so I think it's going well.
Good.
You're tired.
That's awesome. And we'll see everybody next week for immigration with Professor Belanger. So, all right, everyone.
Bye.
Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Good night.